Hey everyone, this is Devin, and today we're going to be going through the biggest build I have ever done with you on video. We're going to be building a social network I call Timeless, and in this social network, each user can only post one time per year. We'll be using Supabase, which is a service that's kind of like Firebase. They offer a database and an authentication service that you can easily integrate into your apps, even if you're just a front-end developer. I'm going to be building the UI for the app in Vue 3. So we're going to have a lot of fun integrating those two together. This video will be in two parts. The second part will be the actual deployment of the app. So this video will cover the entire build, and then you'll need to come back to the next video to do the deployment, and we'll actually put this live on the internet so that anybody can see it and use it. Make sure you subscribe to my channel, and if you want a notification when that video comes out, also hit the bell. Before we get started, let me give you a sneak preview of what the finished app is going to look like. This is the completed Timeless app. Users will be able to create a user account by entering their email address and a password and clicking sign up. This will all use Supabase Auth to manage users and authenticate users. They'll be able to click New Post to create a post. After creating the post, if they refresh, they will see that post attributed to them. They'll also no longer be authenticated, which is something I talk about in the build. Once they have posted, if they try to post again within a year, that post will fail. And of course, when they're looking at the app, they'll see a reverse chronological list of all the users' posts. That's what you're going to have by the end of this video. Let's get over to the computer and get started. We have some preliminary work to take care of before we can start writing any code. I'm here at app.supabase.io. The first thing I need to do is set up my account and create a project. I'm just going to log in with my GitHub account. And now I click on this new project button, choose an organization. Now I name my project, put in a password for my database, and then select a region. I'm going to pick West US since I'm in Seattle. It takes a few minutes for that to provision. Over here in my terminal, I'm going to start building my application. I'm going to be using Vite as my build tool of choice here. I got to use it on a project recently, and it's really fast. To initialize a new app, I'm going to do npm init at vite.js/app. And press return, and this should interactively walk us through creating this new project. The project name is going to be Timeless. Supabase. Framework is going to be Vue. I'm just going to use JavaScript here. All right, now we need to change into that new directory for the new project, install all the dependencies. Now we are ready to start the development server, except that we're not. We also need to initialize Supabase. First, I'm going to install their command line interface. I'll do that with npm I, which is just a shorthand for npm install, -g, which means I'm installing globally. That's usually what you'll do with these sorts of command line utilities because you want to be able to run them anywhere, no matter which project you're working in. So I'll do npm I -g for a global install, and then Supabase is the name of the npm package I want to install. Okay, now we should have that. And I'm going to initialize a Supabase project, just sticking with the defaults. All right, what this CLI does is it lets me develop a Supabase application locally. Supabase requires Docker and Docker Compose. So if you don't have Docker installed on your system, and if you don't have Docker Compose available, this will not work. I have Docker Desktop running on my Mac right now, so the Supabase init ran through just fine. If you don't have that, you're going to see some sort of error about Docker Compose not being available, something along those lines. You'll know that means, okay, I need to install Docker, or I need to start Docker, or something along those lines. It can't find Docker is the gist of it. Now I'm going to open this project in Visual Studio Code. If you have the Visual Studio Code command line tools, you'll be able to do that by just typing code space and then dot. Dot means the current directory. So by typing that, you're saying start Visual Studio Code and open this directory we're in inside our terminal. That should give you something that looks like this. The first thing I want to do before I even run my development server is I want to make sure that no matter where this application is running, whether it's running locally or if it's running in the cloud, it can access the correct instance of Supabase. I'm using the command line tools for local development, which gives me a local instance of Supabase I can run the app against. If we switch back over to the terminal, you'll see underneath my Supabase init command, it has output for me all the information I need to connect to that local instance. That's going to be at localhost port 8000. Here is the key. Here is the private key, and then here is the database URL to connect directly to the Postgres database. I need to give some bits of this information to my application so that it can connect, and those details are going to be different when I'm connecting to the actual Supabase instance that's running on Supabase's infrastructure. These are just my local connection details. Vite has a nice way to handle this. I'm looking at the documentation for that right now. You can use these environment variables that it will just replace when you build your application. Typically, you use environment variables on server-side code, and it actually reads the environment variable from the system it's running on. That can't happen here because you're building a front-end application, and the front-end doesn't have access to that environment. All it has access to is the browser, so it can't read environment variables. When Vite builds, it will replace these environment variables that you reference through this import.meta.env object. It will just replace those with the actual value when it builds. So this import.meta.env .mode or whatever environment variable you're referencing will never appear in the built code. It'll be whatever value you've assigned to that. If that's confusing, it'll become a little bit more clear as we actually implement this. I'm going to use these .env files to make sure that I am connecting to the correct instance based on the environment. Specifically, I'm going to use these .env.mode files. And the modes, if you scroll up on this page, there's a link here where they show you the different modes that are available. It looks like there are really two that run through serve. Serve is going to be the development mode. So when you start your local server, it's going to be running in development mode. So your .env.development files, variables, will be loaded in that mode. When you run the build command, it runs in production mode. So .env.production, any of those environment variables will be loaded when you build. You can see further down the page here, you can sort of create your own modes, but I don't think we really need that for this application. Let's flip back over to code. I need to create two files. I need a .env.development, and I need, actually, let's go ahead and just fill this one out. Let me reference here again. You need to prefix the environment variables you want access to, and I think you prefix them with Vite _. Here we go. To prevent accidentally leaking environment variables to the client, only variables prefixed with Vite _ are exposed to your Vite processed code. So like if you had these two environment variables set, Vite only cares about this one. That's the only one that's ever going to get through to your built code. And then this next paragraph, they tell you how you actually use it. So if you created this variable, Vite _sum_key, that will be referenced in your code as import.meta.env.vite_some_key. But before I get to setting up these environment variables, I want to take one quick detour because we need to know exactly what Supabase needs to make this connection before we can start providing that data through the environment variables. To do that, we will start getting Supabase integrated into our app. To make things a little bit easier to integrate Supabase, I'm going to be using this Vue 3 Supabase library. It's pretty easy to install. I'm just going to copy that and flip back over to my terminal, paste that in. And actually, one thing I think they've forgotten here is this will need to be saved as a development dependency. So I'm going to say save dev. That will add it to our package.json. That way, if anyone else collaborates on this code, or if we come back to it years down the line on a different computer, or if we've formatted our computer since then, we'll be able to use npm install and get this package that we need as well as everything else. I only saved it as a development dependency because it will be built into the final package for production. So it doesn't have to be installed in any sort of production environment, only in our development environment. Then we'll build out the final distribution package to go onto our server or wherever we're going to be hosting this. Flipping back over to that library, I'm going to use their documentation to figure out how to set this up. We're going to first import Supabase. We'll just copy that, flip back over, and this is going to go into our, I think our main.js file. Yeah, I think this is right. Let's just put it there. And they've created the app. We just need to add this code so that the app knows to use Supabase. And we haven't actually captured the app, so we do need to do that. You see here, instead of, we just created the app and immediately mounted it, but we need to get a handle on the app so we can give it this Supabase library. Let's change this up to do that. We'll say const app equals, and we'll just stop that there, and then we can mount the app. And I'm not sure if this is important, but they are doing it after they pass in Supabase. Just in case that order is important, I'll just mount it at the very bottom of this file. Now, the reason I skipped over and did this instead of continuing with the development variables is because these are the things we need to feed it through our environment variables. Sorry, environment variables, not development variables. We need the Supabase URL and the Supabase key. Now we can flip back over to our Supabase init output. That's going to be this for the URL. And again, we're not going to just plug that straight in there because we're going to have two different URLs depending on the environment. So we're going to create one of these environment variables, prefix it with vite underscore. This will be Supabase URL. Oh, I think these don't have spaces. Let me check that. Yeah, no spaces in these environment variable assignments. This is not JavaScript. This is shell stuff. So that's why the syntax is a little bit different. Now we need vite Supabase key. I believe that is going to be this public key, but I'm not sure. We're going to try that, and if it gets angry, we will go back and revisit. You may be wondering, why name these vite Supabase URL and vite Supabase key? Why not identify the environment in there, like maybe Supabase underscore development underscore URL or something like that? The reason we're not doing that is because I want to be able to use this same environment variable name in my application to refer to the URL, whether we're in a development environment or the production environment. Vite is going to take care of swapping those out based on what sort of build it's doing, whether it's building for the local development server, in which case the environment variables will come out of this file, or if it's building for production, then it'll use this other env file that we're about to create. Let's go ahead and do that now. I'm going to right-click on env development, duplicate. This one is going to be .env.production. To find the values we need here, we need to switch back over to the Supabase dashboard. Here we are in the dashboard in our project. We need to, in this left-hand toolbar, hit Settings. Then the sub-tab we need is API. Here is our URL. And then, like I said, I believe this public key is the one we need. Never share it publicly, so this one would not go into the browser. So I'm relatively sure this is the one we want. Okay, now we can flip back over here to main.js and replace this string with import.meta.env.vite Supabase URL. This value can be import.meta.env.vite Supabase key. And I think this one actually has an underscore there. Let's confirm that. Yes. Okay. Oh, and we need the comma at the end since that's not the end of the object. I'm not worried about plugins to help with these, so I'm just going to close these notifications from Visual Studio Code. Now we should be ready, finally, to start this app. The first thing I want to do is start Supabase with this Supabase start command. The reason I'm starting it first is because without that, the front end has nothing to connect to when it tries to connect to Supabase. Okay, that is running now. We are ready to start the front end, and we do that using npm run dev, which is the script that Vite gives us to run our local development server. Okay, that is running. Let's flip back over to the browser and see what we have there on our local server. Okay, this is just the Vue plus Vite template application, so there's kind of nothing going on here much, especially not in terms of Supabase. We've just got a counter button that we can click, so we know that Vue 3 is working at least. Now that we have our project up and running, we've got Vite working, we've got Vue 3 running on a local development server, and we have the Supabase local development environment up and running. It's time to figure out what we are actually building here. In order to do this, I have downloaded from my website, raddevin.com, a starter kit that was built specifically for this project, which I'm calling Timeless. This is going to be a social network that allows the user to post one post per year. If you navigate over to my website to the page for this video, you'll have a form you can fill out with your name and email address that will automatically send you your own copy of this starter kit. It's going to come as a zip file, this one right here. You'll just double click on that, it will expand it, and then you can surf through the contents. This README file tells you just what we have here, and then I've got two folders. I've got UI, which gives you some ideas about what this might look like. This gives you kind of a starter for the interface for this project. And then UX, which is more about how the app is going to work. I'm not going to worry too much about recreating this exactly, but it is a good idea probably to check out this Annotated Wireframes Pdf. I'm just going to quick look at here on my Mac. This is going to tell you what the designer conceived of as the interface for this site and then how those things would actually work together. Another nice thing you will get in this starter kit if you decide to download it, in the UI directory here, you have some starters, like I said, for the interface. I don't think I'll really use any of these, but if I go into the image directory here, I do have a logo for the project that you can use, an SVG logo. So that might be nice just to spruce it up a little bit. Switch back to the Supabase dashboard in the browser. The first thing I want to focus on in building this app is my data. What sorts of things do I need to store? And for each one of those, what pieces of information do I need to store about them? This is an SQL database, so it uses the concept of tables. You can think of a table as like a sheet in Excel. You have rows and you have columns. Each row is going to represent one of whatever the things are that you're storing in the table. Each column is going to represent one piece of information you have about each thing. This will be a pretty simple application. We're going to have to store our users' posts. Each post probably needs a body, so some text that makes up the content of the post, a time and date at which it was posted, and I'd also like to, in the application, be able to show who has posted each post. So I think the final column that's going to be important for our posts is a relationship to a user in the app. In order to do that, we have to be aware of one attribute of Supabase's authentication, which we're going to be using to log people into the application. We cannot get to the user information that's stored in Supabase authentication from our application. If we want to be able to look up something about the user, we need to create a table that also stores whatever information we want to be able to look up about that user. Supabase has a shortcut to help us do this. If you're looking at the Supabase UI here and you have your project open inside Supabase, you can go over here on the left-hand sidebar and click on SQL. Then on this welcome view, if you scroll down, you'll see some quick start templates. Click on this one called User Management Starter. It starts by creating a table called Profiles. It adds some columns to that table and some constraints. It enables row-level security on that table. It creates a few policies to determine who can access data in the table and who can change data in the table. It sets up real time on the table. It sets up storage buckets for user profile images and some policies dealing with those. I want to simplify this a little bit. I don't think we're going to need all of these features. I will start by ditching everything related to profile pictures. The avatars I don't think we're going to use in this. I will leave on this real-time stuff, even though I'm not sure we're going to use real-time in this app. The policies I think are fine. Here's what these actually do. This one is a policy for select using true, which means there's no case where someone can't read a profile, even if it's someone else's profile. Next, we have a policy on creating profiles. Whenever there's an insert, which is the SQL verb you use to create a new row, the database will make sure that the current user is the same as the ID of the row that's being created. And that's similar for this last policy. This one is for updates. This ensures that only the user can update their own profile. No one else can update a different user's profile. Those are all good. We're going to leave those intact. I am going to change the table a bit. This first column, the ID column, which is a UUID, that is the data type, which references auth.users. What that's doing is it's creating an ID column that will mirror the value of the user's ID in the authentication table, which we can't see in the application. This will basically give us another copy of that ID that we can see in the main application. Then we can store other data alongside that. We've got updated at. I don't think we really care about that here when the user profile was updated. We've got a username. To keep this simple, I think, I'm just going to use the email address. We don't have an avatar URL because we're not doing that. And I'm not going to have a way for users to edit their profiles inside the UI, so there won't be a way to provide a website. Then on our constraints, the ID is still going to be the primary key. This unique constraint is no longer applying to username since we got rid of that column, but it will apply to the email column. They've set up a length constraint for the username that gives it a minimum of 3 characters. I'm not going to do that. The last thing I need to do that goes a little bit beyond their template here is I want to automatically create a new profile record each time a new user is created. I'm going to flip over to another tab here where I have the Supabase documentation open. I'm in the overview section, I'm in auth, and if you scroll this right-hand sidebar, you'll see under tips, create a public.users table. This is a recipe for creating a new user inside a public users table every time a new user has been created in the authentication system. This is not exactly what we're going to do, but I am going to go ahead and copy this and use it as a basis for our query. I'll paste it over here in the query editor. They're creating a function called handleNewUser. That's a fine name for this. But they are inserting into public.users. I want to insert into public.profiles since that's the table I'm creating here. They're only inserting the ID. They are inserting it as whatever ID has been inserted for the authentication user. That is good, but I also want to insert the email address, which is just going to be that user's email address. One nice thing about this editor is when I'm typing, it will give me some autocomplete so that I can see that that is in fact the name of the column that's going to be entered on the authentication user that I can also then copy over to this new record in my profiles table. If you wanted to look at what data you're going to have available, you could flip over to authentication here, and you'll see the different columns you're going to get access to. Although you don't really see exactly the names of those columns. This, for instance, last sign in, that wouldn't be the name of the column. But if I wanted to get that last sign in, I could probably come over here to my query and say, okay, I don't have this column. I'm not going to have this column, but let's say I wanted to grab a last sign in column. I could come down here and say new dot. Start typing last, here's last sign in at. That's probably where that data comes from. But again, this is not necessary for our social network. That should be the only change we need to make, or the only 2 changes, the name of the table and then the addition of the email column and the data to go in it. Looking down here at the trigger itself, create trigger on auth user created, that'll be the name of the trigger. Here on line 43, we have the action that triggers the trigger after insert on auth users, auth.users. That is a table created in the Postgres database and managed by Supabase through their authentication system. That's perfect for us. And then on line 44, for each row, execute procedure public.handleNewUser. That's just calling our function. This all should be ready to go for our application. So I'm going to go ahead and hit run. We have a success, no rows returned. That is what we would expect from this kind of query. I'm going to flip back over to my tables. I should see the profiles table now. I can click on that and see the columns. We only have 2, the ID and the email. Every time a new user creates an account, it's going to create a new row in this table with those 2 values. With the profiles table created, we're ready to create the post table. I wanted to create the profiles first because I know each post is going to relate back to one of the profiles. In order to set up that relationship, the profiles table has to exist. Let's go to new table over here, and we can create our post table. We'll just call it posts. We will include a primary key, even though we may never use this in an application. It's a good practice in SQL databases for every table to have a primary key. You want to always have a value that's never going to need to change, that can always point to a certain record. I'm just going to leave all of the defaults here and click Save. Now we have a post table with just an ID, and we're ready to start creating columns. I will click this plus sign to set up a new column. This one is going to be the body. The type for the body is going to be text. And I don't think we want to allow empty because I don't think that would make any sense in this context. But also we don't need a default value. Let's save that. We want to know when this is created. So I'm going to make a new column. We'll call it created at. This is going to be a timestamp. And this default value is perfect. The timestamp default is going to be now. The nice thing about that is that means we never have to set the timestamp when we're creating one of these. We can always just send the rest of the data without the timestamp, and the default value will kick in. Whenever it hits the database, that's the timestamp that'll be set. And that should be perfect. I don't think we want to allow empty here either, and it won't really be relevant anyway since we have a default value set. Let's save that. The last thing we need is we need to be able to know what user created this post. I'm just going to call this column user ID. This is going to be our relationship column, which means it has to use the same data type as the column in the other table that we're relating to. That one was a UUID. The reason that one was a UUID is because it was also related to the auth.users table, which uses a UUID as the ID column. Let's go ahead and select the type. We'll scroll down to UUID. This one won't have a default value. We won't allow empty, and we're going to add a foreign key relation. The table we're relating to is profiles, and the column is ID. Let's save that and save the column. We should now have our remote database ready to go. Next, we need to duplicate everything we've done on the remote database on our local instance. Unfortunately, there's not a super straightforward way to do that. I have found a couple of commands that will get us there without too much trouble though. Before we can do any of that, you'll need to make sure that you have Postgres installed on your computer. If you're on a Mac and you have Homebrew, I highly recommend you install it using Homebrew. I will share the command that you can use to install that. If you're on Windows, you can download an executable to install Postgres on your system. In either case, you do not want the Postgres server to run. Homebrew will tell you a command to input if you want it to run in the background all the time. We don't want that because it's going to try to run on port 5432, the same port that our Supabase instance is going to be running on already. I already have that installed, so we're just going to jump straight into the commands to move everything over. The first command is pg_dump. This will dump out all the SQL to create your database. If we add a -c option, that will include the create statements. So the tables will also be created. That SQL will be included, as well as the SQL for whatever data happens to be in there. In our database, there's not any data, so really this is the thing. Without the C option, we wouldn't really have much of anything. Now we need a -h option for the host name. To get the host name, we can flip back over to the Supabase UI. You're going to go to the settings cog and then click on database. The host will be the first item. Just click the copy button and paste that in. After your -h, leave a space between. Now we need a -U. This will be the username. The username for this database is Postgres. The way I know that is that it is also in this connection info section in the Supabase UI. There's user Postgres. Back over to the terminal. Now I need a -n. This allows me to specify the schema we want to dump. Any tables that you create, like the profiles table and the posts table that we created earlier, are going to be inside the public schema. Finally, we have a positional argument that is the name of the database, which is also Postgres. And again, that comes from the connection info. Database name is Postgres. We could run the command just like this, but it wouldn't do us much good because it would just spit out all this output right into the terminal. What we want to do instead is we want to use an angle bracket to redirect that output to a file. I can name this file whatever I want. I'm going to call it timeless.sql. Now we can press return to run that command. This is the password for our database, the password we created when we originally set up the app on Supabase. Okay, that dump is done. If I list the contents of my directory, I should see there the timeless.sql. Next, we need to get this SQL into our local database so that these two are in sync. We'll do that with the psql command, -h to specify the host. This one's going to be localhost, -u for the username, and it is again Postgres. Now the database name is also Postgres. That's the positional argument. Now we're going to use the other angle bracket and give the name of the file we saved out earlier to redirect the contents of the file into PSQL. Now we're being asked for the password for our local instance, which I believe at this point in time is always going to be Postgres. We got some errors here, but I'm not sure if that's a problem. As long as the other commands ran, it should be okay. But I do want to try to verify that. And in order to do that, I want to connect to my local instance. Unfortunately, at this point in time, the Supabase local development environment does not spin up the same UI that you get when you're on the live production Supabase. So you don't get that nice UI where you can view your tables and look at your users and all that stuff. You kind of have to do that on your own just by connecting to your local Postgres instance. I'm going to be using a Postgres client called Postico. I guess that's how it's pronounced. It's a really slick macOS client. It does cost some money, but for me it's been worth it. It's a lot easier to use than some of the alternatives. You can grab, the most popular one is pgadmin, and that's available for free for any operating system. I'm going to continue using this, but it should be pretty easy to translate what I'm doing here into one of those other applications. You'll just need to use the same connection details through whatever UI they provide you. In Postico, I can give this a nickname. I'm going to call it timeless local. The host is localhost, so I can leave that. The user is going to be Postgres. The password is also going to be Postgres, and the database is going to be Postgres. Let's try that and make sure we get connected. We did, and it looks like we have both tables. I'll just take a peek and make sure they have the columns I expect. Yep, that looks right. Profiles. Profiles looks right also. I'd also like to see if our trigger got created. Just confirm that that is here also. In order to do that, I'm going to go to this SQL query, and this just lets me type in any SQL query I want to run on this database. I'm going to do select star from PG_trigger. Let's take a look here. I'm not seeing our trigger at all. These are all constraint triggers, so I don't think it is here. Rather than trying to dump those things separately, I've only got one. So I think what I will do is I will just go back to the SQL tab here on Supabase, and I can look at my user management starter to see what I ran. And then I can just grab these. I might want to just go ahead and grab the policies too. I'm not sure they got created. I'm sure it will complain if they're already there. Okay, let's grab everything there. I'm just taking everything except for the create table because I know that did get through. Let's execute that. Looks like our policies already exist, so that's good. Let me go ahead and just delete those. Let's try again. The function already exists. So let's get rid of that too. And it looks like all of this stuff, all the real-time stuff and the row label security, those all succeeded. We just got the error on the handle new user. So let's try this Let's try to execute this last one. Create trigger. So that one was created. Okay, a little bit odd there. We got the function through, but not the trigger. But now we should have everything. In fact, let me just go back in time here and select our triggers again and see if I see that one. Yeah, it's down here at the bottom now. On auth user created. All right, at this point we should have an identical setup on our local instance and our remote production instance. We're finally ready to start writing the actual app. The first thing I'm going to do is switch back over to my terminal, because in order to copy the database across, I stopped my local development server. I'll need to start that up again with npm run dev. Now if I go back to the browser, I can open a new tab and pull up localhost 3000 and see my app again. Let's flip over to Visual Studio Code. I'm going to expand this source directory and open up my top-level app component. Now let's just close down this sidebar with Command B. I believe it's Control B on Windows. I don't need any of this code anymore. This is all for the boilerplate. So I'm just going to empty out this template. I'm going to get rid of this setup attribute because I'm not going to be using the composition API. I could try that, but I'm kind of new to Vue 3. I'm already tackling a lot of different things here, so I don't want to throw too many different variables at this application. I don't need anything inside this script tag either. Some of these styles could work as a baseline. I don't think I will want all the text to be centered, and I don't necessarily know that I need this margin. We can always restore that or some other margin later if we need to. The fonts and the basic font color might be okay though. Let's just leave those for now. Thinking about a really simple version of this social network, I think the layout could just be a header bar across the top. That's going to hold the login form and any actions the user can take, which probably will just be logging out or creating a new post. Then below that, we'll have the feed that shows all of the current posts. Before I get into creating those things, I'm going to save this and just check it out in the browser to make sure, okay, yeah, that's about what I expect. Make sure I don't have any errors in the console, and it looks like I don't. Let's flip back over to Visual Studio Code. It sounds like I have sort of two components that live inside this top-level app component, those being the header bar and then the feed. Let's open the sidebar again with Command B, Control B. I'm going to expand the components. I don't really need this Hello World component. I'm not going to use that. I'll just right-click and delete it. Instead, I'm going to create a couple of new files for new components. The first one is going to be for the header. I'm just going to call that timeless header.view. The second component will be for the feed. I'll call that timeless feed.view. Let's close that sidebar again and start with the header. I'll start by just creating the template tag, the script, and the style. You may notice that when I completed those with Emmet, which is what I'm using to auto-complete these tags, in my script tag, it inserted a lot of stuff, and it's assuming that I'm using the composition API. So I'm just going to clear this out. If yours doesn't do that, that's fine. All you need is these script tags. You can type those out manually, however you want to do that. The first thing I want is inside the template, I'm going to put an actual header component, an actual HTML header element. I'm thinking of this header as being divided into two separate sides. On the left side, you're going to have sort of the site branding. Then on the right side, you'll have either the login form if there's no user logged in, or if a user is logged in, you'll have the user actions. In order to do that, I think I want to set up a couple of divs. I can do that in Emmet with div ×2. Again, if you're not using Emmet, feel free to just do this by hand. Nothing I'm doing is any better than doing this by hand. It's just maybe a little faster. In this first div, I think I'm going to have an h1 with an image inside it, and that image is going to be the logo for the site. I know what the alt text is going to be. It'll just be the name of the site, Timeless. I want to grab this image out of the starter kit I told you about earlier. So I'm going to flip over to Finder. And of course, if you're on Windows, you might use Windows Explorer or something like that. You can use a command line. However you want to manage these files is perfectly fine. But inside my directory, here where I've unzipped the starter kit, I've got UI and UX directories. This will be in the UI directory, and it's under the IMG directory. You'll find logo.svg. I'm just going to copy that, then flip over to my project, which for me is in my projects directory, Timeless Supabase, source, assets, and they already have their logo in here, but I'm going to paste this one in. So now I have logo SVG, and actually while I'm here, I can just get rid of their logo. I don't need that anymore. Back over in my editor, I want to point to that new logo, which will be relative to this file, which is going to be inside the components directory. It'll be one directory up, so that'll put us inside source. Then it'll be at assets/logo.svg. That's really it for this. What I'm thinking of is the left side of the header. Now we can come down here to this div, which represents the right side of the header, the action side. Here, I'm either going to have the login form, or I'm going to have the actions that a logged in user can take. I could just code both of those out in here, but I think maybe it makes sense to think of those each as their own components. So let's pull the sidebar back up, create a new file in components. This one is going to be the login form, so I'm just going to call it loginform.view. I want another component to contain my actions. We'll just call that one userActions.view. Let's start with the login form. And here I want to start with a template. Now, what HTML elements do I need to create a login form? By the way, I'm calling this a login form, but I'm really thinking of it as a dual-purpose form that can be used either to log in or to sign up for a new account. I want to make this UI as simple as possible because this is just kind of a quick and dirty build. I don't see a lot of utility in creating two separate forms, especially since they really just have two fields and they're the same fields. I think it makes sense to let that form do double duty. Obviously, we need a form. What do we need inside that form? We need an input for an email address, an input for a password, a button to log in, and a button to sign up. Again, I'm going to do this with Emmet, but feel free to do it with whatever tool you want to use or do it manually. In Emmet, I can use these brackets to specify an attribute value. This first input will be type email. Then it's going to have a sibling input, which is type password. Then we'll just make two buttons and I'll fill those in later. All right. Since I put all those on one line, I'm just going to save this file to get it formatted. That's a little better, I guess. Although I'm going to break everything out to its own line. These buttons are going to say log in. I think that needs to be the leftmost button because I'm thinking of that as sort of the default action. Then the secondary action, which won't be used as much, will be sign up. I want this to be accessible, so I really need to circle back here and add a couple of labels, which means I also probably need names for each of these so that the labels can target them properly. And of course, the labels need to be filled with some text that makes sense. Now let's name the password field I'm going to get rid of the form action because the form's not actually going to be submitted anywhere. We're going to handle this form submission entirely in JavaScript. We'll be writing methods to handle that later. For now, I just want to make sure we have the elements that we're expecting. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. Oh, before I go any further, I also need my script tag. Oh, here are some auto-completions. Maybe if I autocomplete this one, yeah, that's better. That's closer to what I want there. And really, I'm just gonna export an empty object for now because I'm not sure what I need in this yet. Let's save that again. Flip back over to the header. Here in the header, I need to import that component. I will do that down here in my script. So let's import login form from, and then this is in the same directory. It'll just be loginform.vue. That should be good. I also need to export a component here. Now I need to drop in my login form. I could do this now and just style the tag as camel case, the same as the import, but I'd really like to stick with this sort of HTML convention of using, I think it's called snake case, where you have dashes and everything's lowercase. So I believe if I flip back over to my login form, inside my object, I can include a name property. Let's do login-form. Now I think I should be able to use that instead of the class name. We will find out soon enough. Oh, I do need to reference the component here. So we'll say components and the login form I imported. Now we'll save the header. Now I need to go up one more level to the top level app, and I need the header here inside the app. First though, I need to import it. Timeless header from, this will not be at the same directory, so this will be components. Actually, I need a /components/ timeless header. Now I need to export an object out of this, and I need to reference my component there in the components key. Oh, and let's flip back over to the timeless header component. We can define a name for this one as well. Save that. Back over to the app. Now I should be ready to include it inside my template. Let's save the app and flip back over to the browser. There we go. Looks like we have a form here. You might notice that I have an error in the console right now. I'm not super worried about this because these errors could have been coming up while I was in the process of working. So I usually just, if I need to test something interactively, I'll just come down here and clear out this console and then do my testing. If I get new errors, then I know there's probably some kind of issue I need to pay attention to. Otherwise, everything may be fine. The browser may have just caught an error when it hot reloaded after I saved something that wasn't quite done. Now I can go back over to the editor. Now that I have a login form, I need to think about what this login form actually needs to do. Ultimately, it's going to hit Supabase, check a user's credentials, and if those are correct, it needs to have some way to tell the rest of my app that a user is now authenticated. I could do some kind of global state to make that work, but I think with an app as simple as this one, maybe it makes sense to just have a user stored on that top level app component and just kind of pass it around to the components that need it. I can pass a function down into the login form that would allow it to set the value of the user on the top level app. That way, when a user uses the form and it gets the response back from Supabase, if the login was successful, it can go ahead and set that as the current user on the top level app, and it can feed that down into any other components that need it. That means we're going to need a data method inside our component object here. This method always returns an object, and this object represents the component's state. This one we want to have a user key, and to start, the value of that is going to be null because when the app starts, there is no user authenticated. I mentioned that we also need a method to set that value so that the login form can set it when a user logs in. Let's go down here below the components. Not that it has to be here, this is just where it makes sense to me. You can put these keys in any order you want. I'm going to add a methods key that contains an object. Then I can create whatever methods I want on that object to make those available to this component. I'm going to call this one setUser. It's going to take an argument that I'm just going to call user. And all it will do is set this dot user to the value that's passed in as user. Maybe to make this a little bit more readable, I should call this new user. There. That's maybe a little more clear about what's happening here. Someone's calling this method, they're sending in a new user that's the new authenticated user, and we're taking the current value of the user on this component and setting it to that new user. The primary and maybe the only component that's ever going to call that method is actually the login form, which means we need to get it into the login form. We can do that by using props, but from this top level app, we can't pass it directly into the login form. We're first going to have to pass it into the timeless header. That means on the timeless header, we need to create a prop that we can use to pass that method in. To create props on a component, you just add to your object a props key. That's going to be an array of strings, each string representing one property you want to create for that component. We'll just call this one setUser. We'll name it after the method. You can set up your props as an object instead of as an array. That's useful if you want to do something like specify a type for the prop, or if you want to specify a default value for a specific property. We're going really simple here though. I just want to tell it that there is a prop, it's called setUser, and we don't care about anything else. Let's save that header and flip back over to the app. Now that I have declared that prop, I can set a value for it. I'm going to bind this to a JavaScript value. The prop is setUser. That is going to be setUser. What I've done here is I'm passing a value to a prop called setUser. The value I'm passing is essentially this dot setUser, but when you're inside the template, you don't need to use this. The template assumes that any variable you reference is on the component object. Now let's save that. I'm going to flip back over to my browser. It won't look any different, but I just want to make sure nothing's broken. Looks like we're okay. I'm not seeing anything in the console. All right, back to the editor. Now I need to pass that through one more layer from the header into the form. From the header, I'm just going to copy this whole props line because I need to replicate it over on the form. I'll just paste it right here. Now I have a setUser prop on the form as well. Let's save that. Flip back over to the header this time. And here, where I have placed the form, I'm going to do the same thing I did before. I'm going to bind a value to setUser. That value is going to be setUser. Props get referenced on the component the same way methods or other state on the component do. So whatever gets passed in on that setUser prop is going to be this dot setUser for this component. So we can just pass it right on through just like this. Now let's save that and check the browser to make sure we didn't break anything. Looks like we're still okay. Now it's time to flip back over to the login form and make it actually do something. The first thing I want to do is make it really easy to get to the values the user has entered in the form inside my JavaScript. There are a lot of ways I could approach that, but I'm going to do it by allowing Vue to control these form fields. The first step in that, I need a data method inside my object. Again, that will return an object which represents this component's state. All this component really needs to know about is the email address the user has entered and the password the user has entered. So I'll just make my keys email. That one's going to be an empty string to start, and password in the same default value. I need to bind this state to my form inputs. I can do that by using a vModel directive on those form inputs. I'm back up here in the template. Starting with the email field, I'm going to add my vModel directive. Now I'm telling it what this should be binding to. It's going to bind to this .email, which in the context of this template is just going to be referred to as email. What that does is anytime the value of this input changes, the value of the email property of this component state will also change to reflect that change. If the value in state changes, the value in the input will change to reflect that change. It's two-way binding. Now we do the same thing, but for the password field. All right. With those fields under view control, I can now just reference the state whenever I want to get the values out of that field. That means down here inside my script tag in my JavaScript code, if I want to reference the email address the user has entered, I can do it with this.email. Same for the password, except it's this.password. This form is going to need to do two different things. It's going to need to be able to log in a user, and it's going to need to be able to sign up a user. I'm going to go ahead and just add a methods object because I know I will need methods to handle both of those actions. I'll call the first one login user. We'll just leave it blank for now. And I'll call the second one sign up user. The primary thing I'm going to be doing in each of these functions is talking to Supabase auth. In order to understand exactly how I need to do that, I'm going to flip back over to my browser and reference some documentation. I'm already in the auth documentation, so let me just shoot back up to the top of this. This is telling me how I would leverage their authentication in my app to do things like control access to resources and that sort of thing, but as far as I can tell, it's not really telling me how I would create a user or log a user in. Let me see if I can find that in their reference material instead. We're inside the overview now, so maybe that's just a little bit too high level for what we're looking for. Let's go into auth. Okay, this looks like what I'm looking for. When I expand auth in the left sidebar, I'm getting some methods I can call on the auth object in their SDK. Let's look at sign up first, since that's the first thing a user will want to do. This looks pretty straightforward. They've got a nice example here of how you would make this call using their SDK. Let me just copy this example and paste it over inside my sign up user method. One thing I can see right off the bat I'm going to need to change, and I'll need to change this in every example I copy over from their documentation. This Vue wrapper I'm using for the Supabase SDK makes the Supabase object available at this $Supabase. So I'll need to add that to the front of each of these method calls that I do. Let me fix the indentation here so it's a little bit easier to see what's going on. Okay, we're not going to use this hard-coded example email address. We don't want to submit that when a user signs up. We want to leverage our two-way binding to grab the user-entered email address from this.email. Same goes for the password, this.password. Let me collapse this sidebar so we can see a little bit better. That should be it as far as the argument. This is apparently resolving with an object. And in their example, they've grabbed three properties out of that object. They've grabbed the user, the session, and the error. Really, I don't think I'm going to use even the user or the session. I'm just going to grab the error. I really just care, did this succeed or fail? Then I want to come down here on a new line and test for that error just to see if there's anything there. If it does, I'm going to use console.error to log it out. And I need to do something to let the user know That's really just for me to debug, but I also need to let the user know that something failed. To keep things simple, I'm just going to use a JavaScript alert. This will just pop up a box in the browser. We'll just have it say, your signup failed. That's just some very basic error handling. One other thing I need to change before I leave here, and this is about the whole method. Since we are awaiting an asynchronous call inside this method, I need to use the async keyword in front of this method name. We cannot use the await keyword inside the method unless that method is declared using the async keyword as well. Let's flip back over to the documentation and see what we're going to need to use for our login. We'll probably use this auth.signin method. Yeah, it looks like it's pretty similar to the signup method. I'm just going to copy this code, flip back over to my editor, and paste it in. Fix my indentation here again. I'm awaiting, so I'm going to go ahead and add my async keyword so that I can do that. I will fix the reference to the SDK so that it works here in the Vue library. And I need to get rid of these hard-coded values. Email will be this.email, password this.password. And again, they're capturing the user, the session, and the error. I still don't think I'm going to use the session. We're going really simple here, as simply as we possibly can. But I will keep the user because I need to set that value back on the app component when a user is logged in. I'm going to do kind of the same thing here in terms of error handling. Let's just copy and paste that in. This is not the best way to do it, but it is the fastest. Instead of your signup failed, I'm going to say your login failed. If there's not an error, I need to call that setUser method, and I can pass it the user we captured earlier from the result of that Supabase auth sign-in call. Once a user has attempted to log in, it would also be nice to just reset the form for them. And I can do that since we're using two-way binding on our form inputs. I can do that just by setting these state properties back to empty strings. Let's save the login form now. Let's flip back to the browser and make sure nothing has exploded on us. Looks like we're still okay. Back over to the editor. It'd be nice to have some way to see if this works, and I think there's a quick and dirty way we can check. I'm going to flip back over to my app component, and down here underneath the header, I'm just going to put the user there. This will be temporary, but this will let us see if the user is getting set. If it is, it should appear right below the form. That means in order to really test this, I need to first sign up. I'm going to just use my email address and just a generic password here. Let's sign up. Hopefully in the video you could see that the whole page flashed a little bit. That happened because the form actually tried to submit. When you submit a form in a browser, it wants to post that data back to a server, and then it's going to get something back, and then it wants to display that to you as if you've navigated to a new page. We want to handle this form submission in JavaScript, so we don't want the browser to be doing that. We don't want the browser to try sending whatever data we input here off to the server. Let me flip back over to my editor and see if we can fix that. Also, I've made a bigger oversight here in that I haven't done anything to hook up these new methods to anything. So they're just hanging out here. They're not actually called anywhere. So let's go back up here in our login form to the template. And I need to do a few things here. First of all, I mentioned before that I think of the login as the default action. Now what I could do is I could go in here inside my button and I could add a click handler and tell it on click, I want you to log in user, and that would work fine. But a better way to do it, since I do think of this as the default action for this form, I'm going to instead bind that to the form's submit event. The submit event gets fired when a submit button is clicked or actuated in any way with a keyboard or whatever on the form. It also is triggered if the user presses return inside one of the fields on the form. So by binding on this submit event instead of a click event on the button, I'm catching a couple of different ways that a user might interact with this form. Now let's bind it to that method. I want it to log in the user, but this still doesn't prevent the browser from trying to do what it does by default, which is submit the data back to a server. In order to stop that from happening, I need to add a modifier to my event listener here. I do that with a dot, and the modifier I need is prevent. That's short for prevent default. You may have seen event handling methods that start with something like event.prevent default, and they're calling that method on the event. This modifier in Vue does basically that. It's going to prevent the default browser behavior. With the default browser behavior, I can't do the JavaScript stuff that I want to do. I can't run this sign-up user or the login user because the browser is sending the data and trying to pull back new HTML and load up a new page. That means my JavaScript doesn't really get to run. By preventing the default behavior, though, the browser's just going to stay put and run the JavaScript I tell it to. That's what we want there for a login. We need to do something a little bit different for sign-up. First of all, in order to keep this sign up button from also being a submit button and triggering the submit event and trying to log in the user instead of signing up, I need to give it a type attribute of button. I've always thought this was a little bit odd about HTML, but when you create a button inside a form, the default type of that button is a submit button. If you want it to just be a plain old button, you have to give it this type attribute with the value of button. This is not a Vue thing, this is just HTML. Having done that, we can now assign a click handler on this sign up button, and we can rest assured it will not trigger the form submission, so it won't be trying to log in the user. What we want it to do instead is we want it to call this sign up user method. Let's save the login form, flip back over to the browser, and try this again now that we actually have things wired up. I'm going to click on the sign up button. You notice we are not getting that flash, so that's a good thing. We also did not get any error in the console, so that tells me this probably succeeded. This is not the way this is going to ship, by the way. We're going to give better feedback to users, but it looks like it did succeed. Since it doesn't clear out the fields, I can pretty easily test that by trying to log in. Let's just see if that works. And it looks like it did. You can see here now, where I put in the user inside the template, it's rendering out all of the properties of that user object. That means I successfully created the user and logged in. Now I'm logged in as my user that I just created. That is a great start. I'm going to flip back over to my editor, and in this top level app component, I'm going to get rid of this user. I don't actually want that rendering out. I was just doing that so I could make sure that that was being set properly and that the login was succeeding, which it looks like it is. That form is certainly not done. We're going to want to, at the very least, do some styling and make it look a little bit nicer. But I'm going to save that for later. For now, I want to tackle the other half of the header, and that is the user actions component. This component is going to be really straightforward, even more so than the login form. Let's start with a template. Inside that, I'm going to have two buttons. The leftmost button will be for creating a new post, and the other button is going to be for logging out. Put those on separate lines. I need to add a script tag to this component. Oh, let's try that again. We found another completion that's a little bit nicer. If you don't have these completions installed, it's not a problem. You can just type this out manually. It will still work just as well. Right off the bat here, I'm going to start by adding a prop, and that's going to be a set user prop. Since I have a logout button in these actions, I need to be able to set that user back to null from this component. It'd also be nice, like we've been doing with our other components, and I like to do this at the very top of the object, the component object I'm exporting. I'm going to go ahead and give this a name. We'll just make it user dash actions. And I'm going to set up my event bindings here for these buttons. We're going to bind the click event on both of them. This one I'm going to write a method called createPost. We'll circle back and write these a little bit later. For this one, I'm going to write a method called logout user. I can go ahead and add the methods object here, and we'll just drop stubs of each of those right in here that we can fill out next. I'm going to start by writing my logout user method just because I think it's going to be pretty straightforward. It will need to use the Supabase SDK, so let me flip back over to my documentation, make sure I understand how I need to do that. This is going to use the signout method. That one is very straightforward. I'm just going to copy the sample and paste it right into my code. We need to change the reference to this $Supabase. Also, again, since we are awaiting an asynchronous call inside this function, this needs to be an async function so that it can do that. Otherwise, it will throw an exception for us. Now we potentially have an error we need to look at. So let's go ahead and do some really basic error handling. If there is an error, we're again going to log that out to the console using console.error. If you're not familiar with console.error, it works pretty much the same as console.log. You may be familiar with that. It just writes whatever message you want out to the console. Let me switch over and show you that really quick. If you have your website up here and then you have developer tools open, you can have a console open down here at the bottom, and these log messages are being logged out using console.log or sometimes console.error or other console methods. You can also hit this tab at the top if you want to get a full screen console just devoted to the console. So if we hit that error, it's going to be logged out down here and it'll be styled red to look like an error. That's kind of the only difference between console.error and console.log. In fact, let me just log something out for you so you can see what it looks like. This is a regular log. Okay, you can see how that got logged out right here on the line below that method call. Now let's try an error log. And that's what that looks like. Back over to our code. We also want to tell the user about this. I'm going to use the alert again. We'll just say your logout failed. In the else case, meaning we don't have an error, so the signout succeeded, all we need to do is call the setUser method, which will be passed in, but hasn't been yet. So actually this won't work right now. All we have is a setUser prop, but we're not passing anything into it. In fact, we're not even using this component. We don't have it rendering out anywhere in our app. So we'll go back and do that and pass in the setUser function on that prop so that this will work. I think that's pretty much it for the logout user method. So actually, let's go ahead and get this rendering out. This is going to be inside the header, so I switch back over to my timeless header component. The user actions will be rendered in this second div. And I'm just going to go ahead and pass in that setUser method. It's the same one we're passing in to the login form. And I named the prop the same thing too, so that's just going to look identical. Now I need to import this component and reference it. I'm just going to copy and paste this login form import and change my name here and here. Then I also need to reference it in the components object inside my exported object for the timeless header. The only thing left is I don't want both of these to render. I only want one or the other. And I want to decide which one renders based on whether or not a user is logged in. I don't have access to that in this component right now. I only have access to it in my top level app component. So it might make sense to go ahead and create a prop so that I can pass that in. I'll just pass in a user. Then I can flip over to my app component. And here where I'm rendering out the header, I can also pass in the user directly out of that top level app component. I'm going to save that app component, flip back over to the header. I'll go ahead and save this one too. And now I have the data I need to make a decision about which of these to render. I'm going to do that by using a vif directive, which is kind of just what you might expect based on the name. I'm going to say vif not user, and then for the user actions I can say velse. And this creates some branching logic inside my template where before we render this component, we're checking to see if there is not a user. That's the case in which we render the login form. If that's not the case, so there is a user, then we're rendering this user actions component instead. One thing I do want to refactor really quick, I think I'd like it better if the condition were flipped. So I'm just going to move these around. I'll make this one the vif and test for the user instead of for not the user. Then I will change this second one to the velse. I think that reads a little bit nicer without the negation in there. So what these directives will do, the vif and the velse, if we have a user, this user actions component will be rendered. In any other case, so the only other case being that we don't have a user authenticated, it's going to render the login form so that the user can log in. Let's save that and flip over to the browser. Okay, we're currently not logged in, apparently, or at least I hope. I'm going to clear out this console to give me a fresh start. And I'm going to log in to that same user account I created just earlier. Ah, perfect. That's exactly what we wanted. The login appears to have succeeded. The user was set on the top level app that was passed down into the header and used to decide which component to display inside the header. Since that user was set, it ends up displaying this user actions component, which has these two buttons instead of the login form. Let's go back to code and back to the user actions component. We will wrap this component up by fleshing out this create post method. When a user clicks on that new post button, I need to present them with some way to enter a post. The quickest, dirtiest way I can think of to accomplish this is just to use the built-in JavaScript prompt function. All it does is pop up a browser default dialog box with a space for the user to type. You can also specify a message to put on that box. The way we use it is we're going to declare a variable. I'm going to call it post body, and that's going to be set to the outcome of this prompt, whatever the user enters into this box. I want it to say, what would you like to post? Then I also want to let them know why this is especially important in the case of this website. So I'm going to say it's, and actually I'm going to change up my quotes here. I'm going to use the backticks instead of the single straight quotes. That way I can use the straight quote as an apostrophe inside the message without having to escape it. It's once per year, so make it count. This will throw up a prompt in front of the user asking what they would like to post. They'll enter their post, click OK, and that value, whatever they enter, will then be stored inside my post body variable. The next thing I might want to do is make sure they actually did enter something there, because they don't have to. They could just leave it blank. And if they do, we probably don't want to create a post for them that's blank. So if there's not a post body, then I'm just going to return early out of this function. We won't do anything else. In any other case, though, I need to interact with the Supabase database, which is something we haven't done yet. Everything we've done has been interacting with the auth side of Supabase. Let's flip back over to the documentation, make sure we understand how to do that. I'm no longer in auth. I am interested in data now, and I want to create data, so that's an insert. I'm going to just click through here on the documentation. Here is a pretty straightforward example. I'm just going to copy this, paste it into my code. Of course, we're going to need to change a few things. The first thing is the reference to the Supabase SDK. Now, before I forget, since this is awaiting an async call, I need to go up and add my async keyword before this method. Let's tidy this up a little bit. There we go. I don't think I'm ever going to need the data that's coming back from this. All I really care about is whether or not there was an error. The API here is pretty much just chaining methods that sound like regular SQL. If you're not familiar with SQL, I've got a video that covers the basics. I'll link that up for you so you can learn that. But if you don't want to watch that, what we need to do here is pretty straightforward. The argument to this from method is the table that we're inserting data into. We don't have a cities table, that's something from their example, but we do have a posts table, and that's where we want this to go. Let me flip back over to my Supabase dashboard and just refresh myself on what our column names are so that I'm sure to get those right. Back in the Supabase dashboard, I'm looking at my tables right now. I'm inside my post table already. My columns are ID, which is going to be automatically generated. I don't have to worry about setting that. I've got a body. I've got a timestamp here that is created at. That has a default value, so I don't need to set it. And I have a user ID, which should be the ID of the user that's posting this. Let's go back over to code. Instead of a name column, I'm going to insert data into that body column. The data I'm going to insert is the post body that I grabbed earlier from the user. The only other thing I need to insert here is the user ID. I'll need to get this from the Supabase SDK based on who is currently authenticated. So let's go back over to the documentation and see if we can figure out how to do that. This is going to be coming out of auth, and it's probably going to be on this user method. Inside a browser context, user will return the user data if there is a logged in user. That's pretty straightforward. That's kind of all we need to know because we are using this in a browser context. I'm not even going to copy paste this because it's going to be more trouble than it's worth to try to wrangle that. Let's just change this value. We need this dot $Supabase dot auth dot user. That method is going to return the user object, and I want to get the ID off of that. So I'm just going to chain the ID property off of that method call. Let's come down here and do our error handling again. If there's an error, I'm going to use console.error to log out the error, and I want to let the user know something too. We'll say your post failed. Now let's save all of that. Let's try this out and see if we can actually post something. Flipping back to the app here, I'm going to click on my new post button. I'll just say test post here. Okay, that went. I'm not getting any nasty messages in the console, so that's a good sign. We don't actually have a way to display posts in the app yet, so we're not going to see anything here. But we can flip back over to the dashboard. Actually, no, this is on our local copy, so we will need to use our Postgres client to see this post. Let's switch to Postico. That is the Postgres client I'm using. I'm going to go into my post table, and let's see, can we refresh? Yes, Command R will refresh, and there is my test post. That means posts are working. We can see we've got a timestamp on this post. It has what's presumably my user ID. So it looks like posting works, with one little exception. We have a small security problem now. It's actually a pretty large security problem. A tricky user would be able to post as a different user if they wanted. Let me show you how they might do that. I'm going to play the part of our tricky user just to demonstrate what I could do here. First, I need another user, so I'm going to log out as this user, and I'm going to create another one. Now I will sign up as that user and log in. Now I'm logged in as a different user. I'm going to go over here into my Sources tab in Chrome DevTools. I'm going to switch over to my User Actions component. If you don't already have this open, you can just hit Command P or Control P and then type in User Actions. And you just want this bare one, the one without any sort of query string on the end. What I want to do here is I want to drop in a breakpoint before the post goes out to Supabase. That's happening here on line 18, or at least starting here on line 18. So I think I'll stop execution up here on line 15. If you click over here in the gutter in Chrome DevTools, that puts in a breakpoint. Once the browser hits that point in the execution, it'll pause everything. It's still interactive though, so you can still access everything that's in memory at that point. I'll show you how it works. I know if I hit this new post button and type in a body for a post, I'm just going to call this one test. Actually, let's call it not me. I'll hit OK, and once I hit OK, that should pause us there on line 15. Okay, perfect. Through the console down here at the bottom of the DevTools sidebar, I have access to everything that's in memory right now, including Supabase. One thing I might want to do is I might want to post as someone else. Maybe I've already used up my post this year and I just want to post again, and I don't care if it looks like it's someone else's post or not. Or maybe I want to make it look like someone else said something that they might not have wanted to say. I'm just copying this insert call that's on lines 18, 19, and 20 up in that user actions component. I'm just copying that down here in the console. The body, we're going to just keep post body. I still have access to that variable because we're paused in execution right here in the application. Then the user ID, I'm going to change this.supabase.auth.user, and then the ID property of that would just give me my user ID, but maybe I want to use someone else's. Now I'm going to cheat just a little bit, or kind of a lot. I'm going to switch over to the database, go into my users table. I've got my two users here. I'm logged in as this one right now. So let's see if I can post something as this user, the previous user that I created, the initial one. This will be a string, and I'll just paste that user ID right in there and then close everything up. This is going to return a promise. So I want to chain a then just so I can log something out to let me know that this got through. Don't sweat trying to follow along with this part unless you just want to. Now let's go ahead and press return. Now I'm going to resume execution. Okay, cool. Now we got done. So it looks like that went through. We can switch back over to the database to see if that is the case. I'm here in the post table. I'm going to use Command R to refresh here in Postico. The second one, that is my new user ID. That's the real one. This first one is the imposter post. This is me posting as if I am another user. If we didn't want both of those to go out, we could have gotten around that. But even with two copies of that post, that's still a problem. That's something you don't want. We can prevent this using a Postgres feature called policies. Let's flip back to the Supabase documentation. And if you go into the resources section, there is a nice article on policies that you can click over here on the left. Scroll down here and it tells you how this works. I tend to be the kind of person who scans the documentation looking for what I want. so I'm not going to be reading this entire thing. I know that the first thing I need to do is I need to enable row level security on the table. I'm just going to select that piece and copy it out because the rest of this I don't think is relevant to what I'm trying to do. Now I will switch back over to Postico. I'm going to click on the SQL query item over in the left sidebar. And now I'll start by pasting that in, but I'm going to add some more to that because just enabling the row level security doesn't do anything for me. All that does is allow me to write the policy I need to prevent that user impersonation problem. This is something like what I need to write, this policy. So let's pull that over. Now create policy. Okay, first of all, they're altering table my scores. That's not a table we have. We're altering posts to enable a row level security. Second, we should come up with a good name for this policy. If I scroll down just a little bit, I notice that you can name a policy with just a string enclosed by quotes. So let's try that. I think that could be a lot more descriptive. We'll say users may only post their own posts. This is going to be on the posts table for all. I'm actually not sure what that means, but let's flip back over to the documentation. I notice this does link us out to the Postgres documentation on policies. So that could be helpful toward understanding some of this. And right off the bat here, this syntax kind of tells me what for all means. I'm putting in my method here, the verb basically, that I want this policy to apply to. So all, I'm assuming, would apply to select, insert, update, or delete. I definitely don't want that because I want other users to be able to see each other's posts. So they need to be able to select other posts. It's really insert, update, and delete that are the problematic ones. One useful tidbit that is coming out of this Postgres documentation is this last line. If row level security is enabled for a table but no applicable policies exist, a default deny policy is assumed so that no rows will be visible or updatable. That means now that we are intending to enable this row level security, if we don't have a policy that allows general users to read others' posts, to select others' posts, then they just won't get those back from the database if they try to query, which is how our app is going to show it to them, which means they'll look at the app and they won't see any posts. Maybe we start with that policy. We'll say anyone may select posts. We'll do this on posts. Now, do we want as permissive or as restrictive? We can read more about these under parameters on the Postgres documentation. Permissive, specify that the policy is to be created as a permissive policy. All permissive policies which are applicable to a given query will be combined together using the OR operator. By creating permissive policies, administrators can add to the set of records which can be accessed. Policies are permissive by default. It sounds like permissive versus restrictive is a matter of whether our conditions are ANDed together or ORed together. If it's restrictive by adding new policies that apply to the same records and the same verbs, we're making it harder for users to do whatever they're trying to do with those records. If we make it permissive, then each new policy is making it easier because you only have to meet one of the conditions. With restrictive, you need to meet all of the conditions. In this case, I think we're only going to have one condition for select, so we can just let this be permissive. Permissive is the default, so we don't really need to specify that. This is going to be for select, select being the query you use to read data from the database. What is next in our syntax? We have to and then a role name. The roles to which the policy is applied, the default is public, which will apply to all roles. I think that's exactly what we need here. We'll say to public. What's next here? Next, and these are either or, I believe, well, in some cases. So you have using and you have with check. And if you look down here, existing table rows are checked against the expression specified in using, while new rows that would be created via insert or update are checked against the expression specified with check. This is only going to apply to existing rows, so this will be a using condition. Now we're just going to specify whatever condition we want to use to decide if a given user can access the posts. We want everyone to be able to access them, so my condition is just going to be true. That way it'll always be true. There is no case where a user should not be able to select all the posts and see them all. You can see that's very much different from this next policy that's going to limit who can post, which checks to see if auth.uid, which will return the user ID of the current user, is equal to the user_ID column on the record being added. Okay, I think that first policy is in good shape. Let's revisit this one for just a second. Is there anything we need to change in the condition? I don't think there is, because I think the column they were checking is the same name as ours. If I look at the posts table, yes, the column is also called user_ID. So that should be correct. That should work for our table too. I think I might leave this for all. Since these policies are permissive, if I understand how this works, even though this applies to all verbs, so select, insert, update, or delete, it will not restrict other people from selecting other users' posts, because I've also got this other policy which adds another condition under which they can select those posts. Look at this. We came in here to keep people from posting as other users, and now we're also trying to figure out how to make it so that they can select other people's posts and read them. But I guess that's the caveat of enabling row-level security. Let's go ahead and try to execute this SQL. I had to execute that twice. This client has a small quirk in that if I have my insertion point focused in one of the statements and I hit execute statement, it's only going to execute that one. So I just selected everything and then executed. It gave me an error on this last one because it had already done the one I was focused in the first time. Should be fine. All three of these were executed. We got the row level security enabled, and both policies were created across two different queries. Eventually, we're going to just copy and paste this over into our remote database because, as you may or may not remember, right now in Postico, we're working on the local timeless database, not the remote one that lives in the cloud. Before we flip back over into the app and try testing some of these things out, just a quick summary again of what we were trying to accomplish. We enabled row-level security so that we could create some policies to secure our application a little bit more. Then we created a policy that would allow anyone to select any post. On top of that, we created another policy that applies to all the verbs, select, insert, update, delete, that would only allow those interactions if the currently authenticated user ID is the same as the one on the post. We are hopeful that that previous policy will override that restriction on select queries, and I think that it will. We won't actually get to test that right away because we're not performing any select queries in the app yet, but we can go ahead and see whether users can insert posts as another user. I'm switching back to my browser here and back to the app. Let's try to run that exact same attack again, now with the new policies in place. We've hit our breakpoint, which means it is time to run our code in the console here. This is me posting as a different user. Go ahead and press return on that. By the way, I just hit the up key to go through my command history in the console. That'll bring you back, and you can keep walking back through that if you want, but I just needed the most recent one. Let's go ahead and hit return there. Okay, our promise is pending. I'm going to resume execution. This looks good. We got this post 403. That's a forbidden error. That means something went wrong with our post. We only got it once, so probably the legit post went through, and this one was rejected. We can confirm that over in the database. Looking at the post table, I'm going to refresh, and it looks like this worked perfectly. What we have here is we have one new post with the body I entered. It says not me either, but this is actually my current user's ID. We did not get the spoof post we tried to slip in through the console. Seems like our policies are working. It would be really nice to be able to see if our select policy allows us to select the posts. So let's go back into our app and go ahead and write that feed component and start getting some posts rendered out in the app. Let's open up the timeless feed. I will start with the template. I'm going to go really simple at first. We're going to go with an ordered list, and we'll just put one list item in it. I'll show you how we're going to use that a little bit later. First, let's go ahead and create our script tag. I want to use this auto completion. Perfect. Before I go any further with this, I'm going to go ahead and save it, and I want to get this rendered out inside the app. That way we can flip back and forth between the browser and see our progress as we build that component. Oh, I do probably want to give it a name. Let's start there before we add it to the app component. We'll just call this timeless-feed. Save that. And now back to the app. First, I need to import that component. Just change that previous import for the timeless header. I need to reference it here. Now we should be ready to go to start using it. Okay, let's take a look at that. Just make sure it renders something. Okay, there's an ordered list with one item and nothing in it. That's what we expect at this point, so that's good. Back to my editor. Now let's flesh this out a little bit. This component is going to need some state because I want it to keep track of the posts that it's pulled down from the database. So let's start there. I'm going to add a data method that needs to return an object which will represent this component's state. I'm going to give that a property posts. And to start, that's just going to be an empty array. Now I can pop back up into my template and start adding some logic to decide when to display these components. The ordered list, I only really need to display if there are posts. So let's say v-if posts.length. 0 is a falsy value, so if the post.length is 0, which is what it will be immediately when this component mounts, this element will not be displayed. But as soon as that is 1 or more, that will evaluate to true, and we'll get this ordered list. For the list items, we really want to repeat those for each of the posts. So we're going to use a v-for directive, and we'll say post in posts. Visual Studio Code has helpfully given me a squiggly underline here, which essentially says that we need a key for this since we're repeating this item. I'm going to add a key attribute. I'm binding it. These posts are going to come back with IDs, and those are all going to be unique. So that should be as good a key as anything, I think. We use the post ID. In the interest of keeping it simple here as we get started, I'm just going to fill this with the post body. We'll just render that out right inside that list item. Now I'm going to save this. We'll flip back over to the app, and if everything's working correctly, that 1 should disappear because post length will be 0. Back over to the browser, and it has. While I'm here, I'm going to clear out this console so that I don't see that red and think something has gone horribly wrong. Back in the editor, now we need a way to fetch the posts from the database. To do that, we're going to use a Vue component lifecycle hook. Let's go back to the browser and reference some documentation. I'm just going to do a search here, Vue 3 lifecycle hooks. There we go, that's the article we need. There's no need to try to memorize a lot of stuff just because you want to be a developer. Most of it is pretty easily referenced. The Vue documentation I've found to be pretty solid. This article contains a list of all the lifecycle hooks you can add to your Vue components. These are just methods you're adding to that object that's being exported out of the component. They're automatically called by Vue at different points in the lifecycle of that component. We can scroll down through here and kind of browse to see what we have. We have before create, created, before mount, mounted. So you have all these different points in the component lifecycle that you can hook into, hence the name lifecycle hooks, and you can run whatever code you want at that point. I think the one we want to use here is mounted, and to be perfectly honest with you, I'm not sure exactly why that one's commonly used to make asynchronous calls and fetch data, but I know that it is. One thing that might also be helpful to visualize how this works is this lifecycle diagram. So click through on that and just take a look at it. This gives you a little flow chart of the life of your Vue component. You can see all the things that happen as it's being created and then as it's mounted into the DOM. And it also gives you a nice way to visualize where the various hooks are called during that process. Back over in my editor, I'm just going to go ahead and add this mounted hook. Now I can stuff whatever code I want in here, and at that point in this component's lifecycle, that code will be executed. What we want to do here is we want to grab some data out of the database. We want to grab that post data. Let's go back over to documentation and to the Supabase documentation this time. I'm going back to reference and into data. I know that we are going to fetch data, so that is a select. This looks like a pretty straightforward call here. I'm just going to copy their example, bring it back over, paste it in my app, and change it as I need to. I need to update the reference to work with my wrapper library. Here I'm going to hang on to both that data and the error that are coming back from this, because those are both going to be useful. We are not selecting from cities, we're selecting from posts. And that should be all we need in terms of changes to that call. I'm just going to save so my formatter makes everything tidy. And I'm going to do my basic error checking again. If error, we're going to spit that error out through the console, and we'll let the user know that something bad happened. That should be good enough. If that doesn't happen, to start, for the purposes of understanding exactly what we're dealing with here, I'm going to just log out whatever comes back. Ultimately, I want to take an array of posts coming back from the database and assign them to that post attribute on this component state. But since I don't know exactly what's coming back, there may be some metadata along with it. I'm just going to log it out to start with. We'll take a look at that, see what it is, and then we can come back and change this to make it do what we want with that object. I think that may be it. So let's save this and flip back over to the browser and see what that does. That did not work well. And as I'm going through my console here, I can see some errors. This is the one that's catching my eye because I make this mistake all the time. Unexpected reserved word. And I just know from having done this so many times what that is. What I've done here is I've used the await keyword inside this mounted method, even though this is not an async method. So I need to add this async keyword to the front so that it can await that call. Let's flip back over and just clear out this console so we get a fresh start. I'm going to log back in. I'll log back in as my original user. We're not getting anything logged out from the timeless feed component that I can see. Let's go in here to that component inside the developer tools and take a look. We also didn't get this alert, so it's almost like we didn't hit either of these cases, and I'm not clear why. Let's do this. Let's drop in some breakpoints. Actually, I'll just drop one right here at the top of this if statement. And now let me refresh to make sure all that gets executed again. Interesting. It did not stop there. I'm not sure why, but the good news is it looks like I've got something in my console down here. Let me expand this array. Yes, looks like we have our posts. That is great news. So let's forget about this breakpoint for now. I'm not sure why it didn't stop there, but it's not relevant anymore either. And now we know exactly what the data is that we're looking at. And it looks like it's just a straight up array, just an array of objects, each one containing one post. So this should be very straightforward to deal with. All we need to do with that is to assign that data coming back to our this.posts. This.posts equals that data coming back from that call. Let's save and see if that renders out properly. Oh, look at that. We have a list of our posts. It doesn't look the way we want it to, but the data is there. We have now proven those policies we wrote earlier work, because here we are, an anonymous, unauthenticated user, and we're seeing all the posts in our app. The next step is to replicate those same policies on our remote instance so that when we go live with this app, the policies will also be in place on that production copy. Let's go back to Post2Co. I am in the SQL query tab. Then in the actual query editor on the top, I'm just going to select all of this and copy it. I'm going to flip over here to the browser, the timeless dashboard, and we're going to go into the SQL tab on the left, run a new query, and we can just paste all of this in from our local instance. Click run, and that should, yes, success. Policies are now in place on the remote Supabase instance. Now we are ready to make some improvements to that select query we just wrote to get the posts. We already pretty much have the data we need, but there are a couple things I'd like to do. First, we don't know for certain what order these posts are in. I think it makes sense on a social network to list the posts in reverse chronological order, where the most recent post is at the top and then they get older as you scroll down. I'd also like to be able to show which user created each post. Then one final thing that won't change the query, but we will need to tinker with the template a little bit. We should put a date or a time or something to indicate when each post was created. Let's flip back over to the editor to start working on that. Actually, no, that's premature. Let's look at some documentation. I think the first thing I want to tackle is the order. Back over here in the Supabase documentation, I don't love how they've organized this. We want to modify our select query. The documentation for that is not in the data section, it's in this separate modifiers section, which kind of makes it seem like a completely different thing, even though it is inextricably tied to the select query. But anyway, this is pretty much what we need. We just need to chain this order method onto our select query. I'm just going to copy that piece and flip over to my code editor. And let's just paste it right there onto the end of the select query. Ascending false. That is, I believe, what we want, because ascending would mean that the first one is the oldest and then they get newer. I think that's right. I always get those mixed up, so we'll just try it like this and make sure it does what we want it to do. Okay, I'm going to save this and flip back over to the app. Let's see what that did. The top post is not me either. Let me go to the database and see. Yeah, it looks like that is our most recent post. So I think that's the order we want, with the ascending option set to false. There are a few other options you have on this order method that we don't really need right now, but they're worth looking at just to be aware of. You can decide whether you want nulls first. We're not going to have nulls in that created column, so that's not relevant for us. A foreign table required. The foreign table to use if the column is a foreign column, and then the ascending option that we did use. The next thing we want to do is pull in some kind of user information about the poster of the message. Let's go back up to the select documentation. I think some of the examples show what we want to do here. Here's querying foreign tables. If your database has relationships, you can query your related tables too. This is what in SQL you would call a join. The Supabase API simplifies the syntax of doing those joins. Now what they've done here is they have a countries table. They're selecting the name column from the countries table, and then there is a column in the countries table that has a foreign key on the cities table's name column. So they're also pulling that in. Let's flip back over to our database. And I just want to make sure that I know how our tables are structured. We have the user ID column, which should be related to a profiles record, and it's related to the ID column on that profiles record. And then I think the thing we would want to show would be the email, because that's something that a user could look at and make some sense of. Ideally, I think you'd want to show some kind of username, but we're not going to use those in this app. Let's go back to the editor and see if we can implement this. Since we're going to pull in a column from another table, we need to specify exactly which columns we want to bring in. Oh, also, it just occurred to me, I'm ordering this by ID, which may have just worked out. Well, yeah, it does work out because the IDs are ascending, but really the thing I care about is created. So just to make it more readable, I'm going to sort this by created at, save that. Let's go back and look. It should be the same order. Yeah, that looks the same. Yeah, don't really care about sorting by ID, except that incidentally IDs are, like the sort is actually the same. Okay, let's start selecting here. We do need the ID because we're using that as a key in our template for the repeating post list items. Let's go back to the table and see what else we need. We need the body, of course. We need created at, because we're going to display that. And then this is where our join is going to happen. We don't need the user ID, but we do need profiles. Let me look at this again. Oh, okay, I'm doing it all wrong. I just need to feed it a single string. Let's switch this out for backticks so that we can have white spaces and it doesn't matter. We can have carriage returns and everything inside our string. Okay, that looks better. Now we've got profiles, and the column we want from profiles is email. Does that look like the right construction? I think so. Let's save this. Let's flip back over and see if our app is complaining. Unable to fetch posts. Could not find foreign keys between these entities. No relationship found between posts and profiles. That is interesting. I'm pretty sure we have a relationship there. Let's look at the structure. Yeah, user ID is related to profiles.id. We are back over here in the terminal where we're running the local development server. And I had to do a little bit of research on this problem. It was kind of a tricky one. It turns out the software that makes it easy to query your database from your application needs to be restarted when there's a new relationship created between two tables in your data. I guess it catalogs those relationships when it first starts, and then it doesn't refresh them as it's running. Since mine's been running for a long time, it didn't know that there was a relationship between the posts table and the profiles table. It's pretty easy to restart. What you're going to do is, I'm here on my terminal, I'm going to just hit Control-C to stop the development server. Then I need to take down the local Supabase, and I do that with Supabase stop. That's going to take a few seconds to spin down that local infrastructure. Then I can run Supabase start again to start it back up. Now we can restart the development server with npm run dev. If I flip back into my browser now, you will see that the nasty error is gone and I have my data back. We're still not seeing any of those new pieces of data that we're pulling in though, because we haven't added them to our template. Let me flip back over to the code editor. Let's create some more room inside this list item. I don't know exactly how I'm going to lay all this out yet, but for now I just want to get all this data in there so I can see it. I think maybe the first thing I want to show is the created at, that timestamp. Then next, I'm going to show the email address of the user who posted this. Let's save that and take a look. Okay, we got the timestamp, but not the email address. I'm not sure why. Maybe that is not how that is referenced on this object. That may not be how this object is structured. So let me do this just temporarily. Let me render out the entire post and just see what that looks like. Yeah, that's the issue. They are nesting the email inside this profiles object. So I need to address that as profiles.email. Post.profiles.email. Now we're seeing the email address. I think this is a good time to circle back and start to look at the presentation of this. It's starting to look pretty ragged. This is not what we want to end up with. I'm not going to go too wild, but I do want it to look nicer than this. The first thing I'm going to look at is that timestamp. I would very much like that to be a little bit nicer. In fact, given the nature of this social network, since people are only going to be posting once a year, I don't know if even the time of the post is all that necessary. I don't know that you need to be able to see when each post was posted with that level of granularity. Maybe just the date is good enough. Let's flip back over to Visual Studio Code. Vue has a thing called a computed property that I think would be the perfect tool to use to solve this problem. It makes it really easy for you to take some data that you already have and transform it in some way for presentation purposes or whatever your need is. I think it would do a great job at taking the date timestamp we already have and presenting it in a different format. The computed property lives on the component, and since I want the computed properties to be different for each post, I think maybe it makes sense to take this post and break it out as its own component. That way, the post component can have a computed property that formats the date we want, and each instance of that post component will have a different formatted date for that post. I'm going to start by grabbing this code I have selected, the entire post li and everything that's contained within it. I'm going to open my sidebar, right-click on my components, and create a new file. I'm just going to call this one post.vue. We'll start with the template and just paste in that code I pulled out of the feed component. We need to make a couple of changes here. First, we don't need this v4 directive anymore. That's going to live in the timeless feed component where we reference this component, where we render out this component. For now, let's just delete that out of here. I don't think we need this key either. I think the same thing goes for it. It's just going to live on this component inside the timeless feed. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a minute. I'll go ahead and add my script tag here. We are definitely going to need a prop because we need some way to get the post down into this component. We'll just call the prop post. And now we can leave all these because it'll still be referenced like that. Those attributes will still be referenced just like that. While we're in here, let me name this component, and we'll just name it lowercase post. Now, I'm going to go ahead and hide this sidebar. I don't need that. And flip back over to the timeless feed. Here we need to import post from current directory post.vue. Then we also need to reference it inside the component. I'm just going to go down at the very bottom and say components post. Now we can render it. Here's where we're going to add our v4 equals post in posts. That will repeat it for each post. We need a key, which will be post.id. And then we're also going to have the post. And we're just passing the current post that we're rendering out in our v4 looping. We're passing that right into the component. Let's save this and go see if that works. Looks like we're still good here. Still have all the posts with the data. We don't have the user anymore. Let's see why that might be. Oh, I thought I changed this. I think this is post.profiles.email. Yeah, that looks right. Okay. Now we're rendering out exactly what we were rendering out before. But what this does is this gives us the ability to have a separate set of computed properties on each individual post. Let's go ahead and implement that for the date to format it the way we want it. I'm going to call this computed property created date. Each computed property is a method, and whatever value it returns is the value you get if you reference the name of that computed property. That's a little confusing, so let me just show you how it works. Just temporarily to demonstrate, I'm going to just return a string that says the date. And I'm up here, instead of the raw created at data that's coming out of the database, I'm going to render out this dot created date. Now notice I'm not calling that. I'm just referencing it as if it were a property. The value of the property will be whatever is returned out of that computed property method. Let's save this and go take a look. There you go. You see each one now says the date. That's not useful. Obviously, that's not what we want to do here. But hopefully that demonstrates kind of how this works. Now we need to think about what do we actually want this to do. Inside our method, I'm going to start with a created date variable. That's an arbitrary name. I could name it anything. It just happens to match the name of the computed property. And I think, given the format, I can just pass this post date directly into the date constructor. So let's try that. It'll be this.post.created_at, I think was the property name. Let's just return that just so we can see if that actually works. Okay, yeah, that looks right. These are different times. Those seem to be accurate reflections of the post times and dates for these. That's not what we want either, though, but now we have a JavaScript date object with the date that's represented by that timestamp in the database. That's going to let us do some formatting. I want to go reference some documentation because I never remember what sort of methods you have on a JavaScript date object. I think I can reference this from MDN. Here we go. Here's a date object. Okay, I'm looking in the left-hand sidebar under methods. The methods that are chained off a prototype here are the ones that I will have on each instance of a date object. I would just like to output maybe the month spelled out, the day of the month, comma, and then the year. I think that would be a nice way to present this. Let's check out some of these two strings and see if any of them get close to what we want. This one has the timestamp as well, which is not what I want. Let's try this toLocale date string. Yeah, this might get us there. Okay, let's try returning that date dot toLocale date string, and let's just see what that looks like without doing anything else. Okay, not exactly what I wanted, but it's closer than what we had. There are some options we can provide this that will probably help, like these: weekday, year. So you can provide options for each segment of the date. I'm not clear what different values we have for the options. I know we have weekday, year, month, and day, but I don't know what the different values are that we can provide. There's a section on using options, but it just shows a single example and it doesn't really specify. Let's try another search. JavaScript date locale date string options. Here is a Medium article. This could be helpful. Locales options. Okay. Date style is an option. It looks like it's kind of a shorthand and maybe sets all the individual options. So let's try some of these. Maybe one of these will do what we want. Let's try date style long. I'm flipping back over to the app so that once we make the change, we can see what it does. Date style long. That didn't really do anything. Did I put it in the wrong place? I think I may have. Okay, yeah, the first argument is the locale, not the options. So let's find the locale we want. I think it'll just be like en-us. Looks like they're doing a German one. So let's just try en-us for our locale. en-us. These locale strings are standardized. They're not anything specific to JavaScript. So I could have looked those up. I happen to remember this one. At least I think I do. I guess we could check and see. Oh yeah, that's actually exactly what I was looking for there. So that works. toLocale date string with the locale of en-U, and then options object with the date style key containing the value long as a string. Gives us pretty much exactly the format I described. So that's good. And you see that since this is a computed property on the component, and a component represents a single post, this created date value that we're using right here in the template is different for each date because it is based on that post's created at property. Before we move on, let me talk really quick about the difference between computed properties and methods. You could also do this as a method instead. I can say created date, and then I could just have this exact same code inside that method. Oh, it's not going to like that these are the same name. Let me give this one a different name. Created date method, and then I could here use created date method and just call it, and the result there is going to be the same in terms of what the user sees. The user is going to see the same date. In your application, though, the computed property is going to be more performant because this method is only called if one of its dependencies change. If I reference part of my component state, like I have here, this.post.createdAt, if I reference that and that date changes, then it will call this again and cache the value. And every time I reference this.createdDate, it will use that new cache value, but it'll only rerun the code when it needs to because something has changed. If I use this method instead, it's going to call that method every single time it needs to render, so not as performant. It's probably not a huge deal here, but hey, why call the method more often than we need to? So I'll just get rid of that and stick with the computed property. That is the first piece of our presentation puzzle. I don't really want these posts to be numbered, even though this is an ordered list, because there is an order to it. In fact, we specified the order in our query. It's not the kind of ordered list that it really makes sense to number 1, 2, 3, 4, though. So let's just get rid of that styling. I'm going to do that over in my timeless feed component. Let's go down to the bottom here and add in a style tag. It's going to make this style scoped, and I think that's fine. I'm going to style the ordered list, and I'm going to apply the rule list style type is none. Let's take a look at that. That gets rid of our numbering. You might notice, though, it still has a wide indentation on the left. That's part of the default styling to sort of make room for the numbering. So let's get rid of that. I think that's a padding. Let's inspect really quick just to see exactly what we're dealing with. Yeah, it looks like it is a padding. If you select the ordered list here in DevTools and click on Computed, you'll see the dimensions of each part of your box, and the left padding of 40 pixels is what we're seeing there. Let me just get rid of that. I'm just going to say padding 0. And now it's flush against the left margin. That's probably all I need to do with that ordered list for now. I'm going to move on to the post itself. And there are a few things I'd like to do here, I think. First of all, I've got metadata, like the date and the posting user. I've got it just kind of jumbled all in with the actual post itself. And these things are not created equal. The post itself is really much more important, and this metadata is just ancillary to that. I want to make sure that the layout reflects that. Let's go back into the code here and make some changes, first of all, to the template, because the semantics are not right, first of all. These two pieces of data need to be separated in some way from this body. I'm thinking of this as a list of metadata because we do have 2 items. So let's make another list here. This one's an unordered list because the order is just sort of arbitrary. I'm going to give that a class of metadata just to make it easier to identify what we are dealing with here. And that's going to have 2 list items inside it. This is the emit abbreviation if you wanted to create this, or you can just code it out manually. Now we have that structure. Let me grab these pieces of data and drop them into it. There's the created date. Let's do the same thing for the email. Let's save and take inventory of what we have so far. Okay, we definitely have those 2 things separated now. Not exactly the way we want, but we are laying the foundations. I'm going to start doing some styling here so we can start to see this take shape. I'm going to select that metadata element. The first thing I'm going to do is change the color because I don't think it needs to be emphasized as much as the body. Let's try a lighter gray maybe. I'm going to try a 777. That doesn't seem to have worked. Let's inspect and see why. Yeah, that style is just not getting applied. Did I spell everything correctly? I think I did. Both instances of metadata look like they're spelled the same. Yeah. Maybe we need a refresh? Oh. Cannot read property created date of undefined. That's an odd one. Let's go back and see if we can figure out what that is. I'm still not sure exactly what this exception is, but one thing I do notice as I'm looking at it is that it's probably not a good idea to call this component post with a capital P and then have all these references to post with a lowercase p referring to the data, and then we've got a prop that's post. The name is lowercase p post. I think this is potentially going to cause us a problem. if nothing else, in terms of readability of this code. So let's go back to the post itself, and let's name this timeless post in sort of keeping with the convention we have with the timeless feed and the timeless header. Let's save that, and then I'm actually going to rename the file to match timeless post. That means we'll need to go back over to the feed, update that here, and here, and here. Now in our reference in the template, we need to change to timeless-post. Let's save that and see what happens. I'm going to just refresh. That is not our problem, apparently. Still think that is a good refactor, though. There seems to be a problem with this unordered list, my metadata, because if I take that out and save, and then refresh, I get all the posts again. As soon as I put it back and save, and then refresh, I am getting the exception again. Okay, I think I found the problem. I don't need to use this in my reference inside the template. That is implicit there in the template. Let's refresh and see if that helps. Yeah, that was it. Okay. You have to use this inside your script tag in any methods you're writing or anything like that that needs to reference data on the component. But in the template, you do not, and in fact cannot, apparently, use this to reference your data. Now we're getting that new color, and we're starting to see in the design the relationships. We don't really want this to be formatted as a traditional unordered list, though, so I think that's going to be the next thing I'll do away with here. Let's go down to the styles for this timeless post component. Let's set the list style type to none. See what that looks like. Okay, better. We can set our padding here also, just like we did with the other list. That looks better too. Now, I don't really think I need these laid out like this. I think I'd like to have them side by side, and they can appear a little bit smaller, they being the metadata, the date, and the email address. I think they can be a little smaller. They can be laid out horizontally and maybe with just some kind of separator between. Let's see if we can take care of that. First of all, let's do font size. What if it's 80% of the base font size? That would be 0.8 em. Okay, that's a little better. To lay them out horizontally, I'm going to change this container, the unordered list, into a flexbox. That should put them horizontally. Yes. Now let's put some spacing between those and maybe some kind of separator. To do that, I'm going to write this selector. It's going to be metadata, and then within that, a list item plus a list item. That's a sibling selector, an adjacent sibling selector. This means inside a metadata element, we're selecting a list item that is after another list item. In our case, that will be the email address is really what we're selecting here. We're selecting the list item element that surrounds the email address. I'm going to focus on the separator. So I'm going to use a pseudo element as a separator. We'll use a pseudo element before that second list item. The content of that pseudo element is going to be the pipe character. Then I want to create margins on either side of that pipe, which will create the spacing between the two metadata elements. I'm using the margin shorthand, so the first property here, or the first value, is going to be the top and bottom margins, and then the second value will be the left and right. Let's try a 5 pixel and see what that does. That's pretty good. I think I can live with that. The biggest problem I'm seeing right now is that there is no separation between the list items. Let's flip back over and create that. This is going to be a style on this top level LI. It's worth thinking about how I'm going to do this without also styling these inner LIs. I think what I'll do is flip back over to the feed component, put the style on that, and I'll make the style OL, and this is a direct descendant selector. That is selecting only LI elements that are a direct descendant of this top level OL. That should not catch any of the inner LI elements which are on the UL, the metadata UL. It might be good to use a sibling selector here too, because we don't want spacing where we're not between two posts. We don't want spacing like below the last post or above the first post. We only want it when we're between two posts. That's a good use case for the adjacent sibling selector. And when we're between two posts, that means we're actually styling the second one. So we'll want the margin above, margin top. Let's try 20 pixels and see how that looks. That's not too bad. We're already looking much better than we were before. Now I feel like I need to start doing some styling on this header, which is kind of just a mess right now. Let's flip back over to Visual Studio Code and turn our attention to the header. I want to split this header apart and have the logo on the left-hand side, and then whatever else we're displaying, either the login form or the user actions, float all the way over to the right. And I think the easiest way to do that, at least for me, is going to be Flexbox. What I will do is I'll take this header element, I'll make that a Flexbox, and then I'll use the justify content, justify items, I can't remember which, but the justify property, I will set it to space between so that the space between those two is maximized and they're kind of pushed out to either side. Let's go down here to the styles. We'll start styling our header element, set the display property to flex. Let me save that and just show you what that looks like. First of all, that's going to put everything on a horizontal plane. This is going to be a little bit weird because this is a pretty narrow viewport. Let's pull it out a little bit to give us some more room here. Now those are just kind of crunched up against each other. That's not exactly what we want here. So this is where the justify content, that's it, property will come into play, and we're going to use space between. That didn't do quite what I expected. Let's take a look at this and see if we can figure out why. Okay, it's probably because this form is just spreading out all over the place. Why is that? One thing I can do that might help is to make this logo a little bit smaller. I don't really want the header this tall. That's pretty bonkers. Let me go in here and just see what size makes sense before I go back and put it into the styles. That might be okay, 100 pixels, or maybe like 120. I think I like that. That's readable. It's not taking up a ton of horizontal space. Yeah, let's go back and lock that in. So we've got header. Let's style our image. This is the only image here, so I can just use an image selector. Width is going to be 120 pixels. And now I can confirm that locked in by turning off this inline style. And we're still good. Looks like we're okay there. What do I need to do with this form? Maybe these need to be split across two different lines. Oh, here's something. As I hover over this H1, I'm seeing it's got huge margins on the top and bottom. It's not really necessary here, so let's just get rid of that. I'm going to go in and style my H1. We'll just say margin 0. That'll trim things up a little bit. Now we just need to figure out how to lay out this form and make it look okay. Let's get some spacing between the elements in the form. Switching back over to Visual Studio Code, I'm going to go into the login form component, and we need to add a style tag into that component. I'm going to say that each input element should have some space after it, so let's set a margin right. of, we'll try 10 pixels. Let's go back and look at that. Okay, that's better. It would be nice if the buttons also had some spacing between them. And actually, I'm thinking buttons just globally should have space between them if we have two buttons next to each other. To do that, I'm going to go over here to the app component and put it in the styles here at the top level. We'll say button plus button. That's our adjacent sibling selector again. That means if there are two buttons together, we want to style the second button with these styles. Should have a margin left of, let's say, 5 pixels. Let's see how that looks. Much better. Just a little bit of separation between those two makes a world of difference. Now, I'm going to close DevTools for just a second so we can see what this looks like without it open. That's actually not too bad. One thing I would like is I would like for these to be centered vertically, and that's pretty easy to do with Flexbox. That'll be back in our header because that's sort of the container for both of those elements. So we got justify content space between. This will be the align items property. We're going to use center. That's the alignment on the other axis of the Flexbox. There you go. Now you can tell that is centered vertically, and you can tell it even better when they're closer to one another. Although I do kind of wish this logo, the text in the logo, were centered with respect to the form. I wonder if there's a good way we can do that without making a mess. Seems like if I hover over my image here, it's nice and compact against the graphical elements of the image, but then if I hover over this H1, I've got a bunch of space at the bottom. It's blue, so it's part of the content area. It's not a margin or padding, but let's see if we can get rid of that. I wonder if it's because of the line height of this H1, and I can test that. Let's set a line height of 1, of 0 maybe. No, that doesn't seem to have any effect. Maybe it's just an issue of having, doesn't have a carriage return in it. Okay, so I found a way to eliminate this additional space without that line height. If I set the display property of this image to block, it eliminates that additional space and makes it center up really nicely. And to tell you the truth, I'm not sure exactly why that works. I had a feeling that it would because I feel like I've done something like this before. I think it may have to do with the font size of the H1, and then the image being an inline element makes it render like text. That's just kind of a wild guess on my part, but we know that this works. Let's go ahead and implement that. The image display property is going to be block. We can toggle that off to make sure that took, and it did. We are getting a little bit tight here in the header now, though. I'd like to spread things out just a little bit. Let's try some padding for that on the header itself. We'll try a 10 pixel top and bottom, and then 15 pixels on the left and right. That's a little bit nicer, except for the fact that it caused our form to wrap. But if the form were not wrapping, here's what we'd be looking at. And I like this breathing room between the top and the sides and the header elements. It does make the feed look a little bit weird, so we might want to equalize the padding on the feed so that it has the same padding as the header, at least from the left-hand side. Let's go into the feed, and instead of a 0 padding, let's just give it a 10 pixel all around and see what that looks like. Oh yeah, that's looking much nicer. You've seen me jostling with this DevTools panel to make things look the way I want. If you were really shipping a production app here, you'd want to make sure this laid out properly on mobile devices, so you definitely want to do something for this. In fact, you probably would have wanted to design that first. But we're keeping this quick and dirty, so we're just gonna go with this. It looks the way we want at, about 1100 pixels, so we're gonna be okay with that for now. I am going to log in and just see how the user actions component looks and make sure that looks okay, see if we need to do anything on that. It's pretty basic. I think it's just the 2 buttons, so we're probably going to be okay there. Yeah, that looks good. That's all we need to do there. We don't need anything else, I don't think. We've got a pretty minimal design here, but I think it works well. It's not bad to look at. It's readable. You can kind of understand what you're looking at here, I think. I would like to add a couple of niceties to the login and signup form. Let me switch over to that component, loginform.view. I don't love the way the signup flow just kind of drops you at the end and leaves you with your email address and your password still in the form fields. And unless there's an error, you don't really get any indication about what has happened. In the interest of keeping things simple, I would like it to just log you in. And we can leverage this existing login user method to do that. So down here in the signup user method, we've got the error handling, but in the case that there's not an error, what if we just ran this dot login user, and what if we just called that method immediately? The fields are still filled. The component's state still has the email address and password. So logging in should just work the same way that after you sign up and it leaves your credentials in the fields, you can click login user and it will log you in. This is effectively just calling the method that click would call anyway. Let's try this out and see if that's better. I'm just going to call this Devin sign up test at raddevin.com. Now let's sign up. There we go. We got sign up and login all in one shot. I'm back over in the login form component inside Visual Studio Code. One other thing I'm not fond of here is that we have no validation whatsoever. It'd be really nice just to have some basic validation so that people are not trying to sign up with empty email fields, empty password fields, or trying to log in without those fields filled. We're trying to sign up or log in with something else in the email address field. So let's figure out a really simple way that we could do some validation on this form. I think it might be nice to use a computed value again. So that's the same technique we used to create the formatted date in our feed. I'm doing this on the login form. I'm going to add a computed object on my component object just below the data method. And again, this could go anywhere as long as it's on the top level of that object. It could go between props and data. It could go at the very top. It could go between name and props. It could go under methods, wherever you want it. This is just what makes sense to me. Let's call this computed value form is valid. What do we need to check to decide if the form is valid? It would be nice to know if they have something in the email address field. It'd be nice to know if it at least resembles an email address. And then it would be good to know if they have entered a password of some kind. I'm going to start checking the email address. So there are 2 things I want to check here. First, I want to check and see if there is anything in the email address field. And then I want to see if it looks like an email address. I'm not going to go too crazy with this. It's going to be very basic, which is to say that it's not going to be entirely correct. This is the first part of my check. I'm creating a variable here that's going to just make this a little bit more readable. The variable is email is valid, and that's going to equal this.email. So is there anything in this.email? And this.email.includes @. This variable is going to be a Boolean value. First, it's going to see, is there anything in the email address? If there is, then it goes on to this second part of the condition, which is, does the email address include an @? Again, this means that this does not really test if this is a valid email address. All it tests is if there's something in here and if it has an @. It could be just an @ and it would pass this test. That's not all that we need to know to decide if the form is valid. But the other part of the condition is pretty straightforward. So I'm just going to go ahead and return. I'll first return email is valid, and then I'll AND that with this.password. What this is going to do is whatever the value of email that is valid is, it's going to AND that with, is there anything in this.password? So if this is truthy, meaning there is something in the email field and it does have an @ in it, and if this.password is also truthy, meaning is there anything in the password field, then we're going to return a true on this. If either of those cases are falsy, so either there's not anything in the email field, there is but it doesn't have an @, or there's nothing in the password field, then this is going to return a false. Now what we can do with this value is we can disable these buttons unless that value returns a true. I'm going to bind a value on this disabled property of this button, and that value is going to be not form is valid. The reason it's knotted is because we're only disabled if the form is not valid. I like to keep my booleans in the positive. I like to frame them in the positive. So form is valid instead of form is invalid, and then I've got to do a bunch of calculus in my head to figure out what that actually means. I like them in the positive, so I do that consistently. And then if I need them in the negative for a specific case, I'll just negate them with the exclamation point. So this is going to be disabled if not the form is valid. Then we can just do that same thing down here on the other button. Let's save that and test it. This will be easy to test. I'm going to log my user out. Ah, look at that. Neither of the fields are filled and we cannot click the buttons because they're disabled. Let's just try an email address here. Now we'll start typing a password. Now we can submit. We can either sign up or we can log in with this combination, or at least we can try. Now it might also be good to reuse that computed value in these methods. Hopefully these methods won't get called if it's invalid because the buttons will be disabled, but there are other ways to call the methods if you really wanted to. So what if we just tested those two? We could say if not this.form is valid, then return early. So nothing happens if the form's not valid and you're able to call one of these methods. I'll just copy and paste that into the signup user method as well. And now neither of those will actually do anything if the form isn't valid. This is not secured. This is all happening on the front end, so a user could circumvent this and get the form to submit anyway and get these calls to go through, so don't depend on it, but it's just a nice little extra safety feature. I can also go up here into my form and by way of an attribute, a required Boolean attribute, so just the word required in each of these inputs, I can tell the browser that these fields are required. You have to put something in those. That's a good practice for accessibility because I believe screen readers will actually let the users know that those are required fields. The screen reader won't know about that JavaScript we just wrote, so it couldn't tell anyone anything about that. Let's flip back over to the application and I will show you the last problem I'm going to focus on fixing before we try to deploy this app. I simplified things just a little bit off camera to get us down to one post. This is a single post from my initial user account that I created. I'm going to log back in as that same user, and I'm going to create another post. Oh, I still have my breakpoint in. I'm just going to turn that off and then resume execution. Now let's refresh. Okay, now I have two posts. This was kind of the whole idea behind this social network. This is the thing that makes it different from everything else, is that you can only post once per year. But here we are, posting as the same user within 4 days of the initial post. At this point, we don't have anything cool or different. We just have a really bad, bare bones version of Twitter. So let's see what we can do about fixing that. I'm going to flip over here to Postico, my Postgres client. I also did some research on this and wrote this solution off camera, but I am going to walk you through it. This is slightly outside the scope of what I'm trying to accomplish here, which is the only reason that I didn't show you this whole process play out. Also, it was really boring, and I don't really know what I'm doing with this stuff either, so I hope I can explain it in such a way that you'll understand it. Let me first pull down this query editor. You can see I'm creating two different things here. I'm creating a function that's on lines 1 through 9, and then on 11 through 13, I'm creating a trigger which calls that function. Let me tell you about the function first of all. This first line is basically setting up what we need to do to create a function. This is the name of the function, prevent post within year. The second line here basically tells Postgres that this function is going to act as a trigger function. Now we have this begin keyword, and then we have the actual meat of the function. We have a condition. What we're doing is we are selecting the created at column from the post table where the user ID is equal to the new.userid. New is a keyword we can use to access the incoming post. That's something that we get by nature of the type of trigger we have, and I'll be going over that in just a second. The new record coming in is going to have all the same columns as any other post record, so we can access the user ID for this post using this notation, new.user_ID. I'm ordering those by created at, and that's descending, so that means the most recent one at the top. I'm limiting that to 1, which means all I'm getting is the most recent one. This whole thing in these parentheses is getting the most recent created at date for a post by this user. Now we're comparing that to another value. That value is the current timestamp, so whatever time it is now, whenever this trigger is being triggered, minus an interval of 365 days. We're taking the current timestamp, subtracting 365 days from it. That gives us a day 365 days ago. If the date of the most recent post that we have already is after that day, 365 days ago, then we don't want to allow it because it's too recent. The most recent post needs to be 365 days old or older in order for a new post to come through. That's what this condition is enforcing for us. What it does, if that's the case, if it's too new, if the current post is too new, it's going to raise an exception with just a message. You may only post once per year. That's the end of the if statement. If we get to this point, if we get to the end of the if statement, that means we're okay. That means this condition didn't get hit, because if the exception is raised, then we're out of this, we're done. If we're not done, we know we're okay, and so now we return new. That sort of takes that record that's coming in and sends it on through, it blesses it and says, yes, this can go into the database. That brings us to the end of our function. That's what the end keyword here on line 8 means. And you know what? I'm not sure what this is. This denotes the language that we're writing the function in, and really, I don't know what this language is. I found a similar solution to a slightly different problem, modified it for what I needed to do here, and that's where this whole thing came from. Having heard this explanation, you're only like a quarter step behind where I am having developed it. So congratulations, I guess. Anyway, that's the function that's going to run. Now here's what's going to trigger that function. That's the trigger we're creating on lines 11 through 13. 11 says we're creating a trigger. Here's what it's called, prevent post within year. I just gave it the same name as the function. On line 12, this is pretty important. This is the condition before an insert. So we've got an incoming insert. It hasn't been put into the database yet, and we're only doing that on the post table. On line 13, we're saying for each row, each new row that's coming in, each new incoming row, execute procedure, and then the name of the function we want to call. Every time we get an insert, before that data goes into the database, it's going to call this function, which does all the things I described before. effectively checks to see if there is an existing post by the user that's too recent. If not, it sends it on through, the row gets created, and everybody's happy. I am going to go ahead and execute both of these statements. That will create the function, create the trigger. Now we should be good. We should actually have a somewhat unique social network. Let's see if it works. I'm going to log in. I already have 2 very recent posts. So a post going in right now should not be able to make it through. Let's see if that plays out that way. Too soon. Your post failed. That's the message the user gets. If we look here in the error in the console, we see that message, you may only post once per year. That's the message we set up to throw, or to raise, I guess, in the parlance of this language we're writing in. And just to be 100% certain it did not go in, let's go look at the database. I'm going to pull up the post table. I'm going to refresh. I have 2 posts. I have the original post by my user, the one before we implemented the trigger to prevent posts within a year, and that's it. So it sure seems like we did it. I'm going to go ahead and hit OK here. Now we have a social network that is not bad Twitter. Our last step for this piece is going to be to create the trigger and the function on our remote instance of Supabase. I'm going to switch back over to Postico, go back to my query I ran previously, and just copy this. Now I'm going to jump into the Supabase dashboard. I've already got this query editor up here, so I'm just going to paste over top of that and run the query. Success! Now that live instance on Supabase will also prevent those posts within a year of each other. For the purposes of this demonstration, we're calling this app complete at this point. In an absolute sense, this app is not complete. There are several reasons that you might not ship this out. Let's talk about a few of those right now, just so you're aware of them before we take what we have and deploy it. I'd say the greatest shortcoming of this app is that it has no concept of a session. That means right now I've got a user that's logged in and authenticated. I can post as that user. I can log out as that user if I want. But as soon as I hit the refresh button or close the browser or anything that causes this page to refresh, I am right back at square one. That session is not maintained. That's a pretty bad user experience, probably not something you would want to put in front of users, even if you're building out just like an MVP. I've already mentioned that we could have done a better job on our form validation, particularly the email validation, and maybe we could have found out what the password constraints are in Supabase Auth and enforce those on the front end as well, so that that doesn't have to go off to Supabase before the user finds out that their password isn't good enough. I talked about some security issues earlier, but there are certainly still a few of those that we haven't addressed. The one that comes to mind most of all is that we fixed the problem that a user could impersonate another user and post as them. What we didn't fix is that a user could pretty easily send their own timestamp along with the post. If they wanted to get around the once per year posting limit at this point, it's not as easy as it was before. It's not as simple as just clicking new post, typing a post, and hitting OK, but it's still not extremely difficult to do. They could just type their post here, drop a breakpoint in, stop it before it sends it off to the server, and add that timestamp onto it that's at some other time, maybe in the future. Those are a couple of big things that you might want to take care of if you really wanted to flesh this out. Some other things I might consider doing: allowing users to set a username. Users probably do want to be identified with their posts, or else it's not very a social network, but they may not want to share their email addresses. You might have multiple views. Let's say somebody wanted to share a post they liked. Right now, they don't really have a way to do that. If each post had a permalink where you could go to a page that was just for that post, then someone could take that URL and share it with someone else. That opens up a whole can of worms because that means you're adding routing, but it's not the end of the world. Definitely something that you could do. And there are 100 other features you could add. You could add likes, you could add reshares. Do you only allow someone to reshare once a year? Or is a reshare their yearly post? I don't know. Oh, one more I thought of that I almost forgot to mention that would be really nice for this. Supabase has real-time functionality. Clients can subscribe to updates from the database. That would be a great feature to implement on the feed here. You could subscribe each user to the posts table, and anytime a new post came in, it could just appear in their feed without them having to refresh or anything. Now they're getting a snapshot of whatever's in the database when they load the page. If you want to take this a little bit further, feel free to tackle any or all of those projects. But I would encourage you to take what we already have and get it deployed before you start augmenting it with additional features. That's going to be a super valuable experience for you, and you want to make sure that you don't get bogged down in feature creep and not get to that. That is the build. Thanks for building along with me. Thanks for sticking with it for that entire process. But it's not really the entire process because we haven't deployed yet. Do not miss that step. To make sure you don't miss it, subscribe to my channel. Maybe ring the bell if you want to get a notification when that video comes out. That'll be the next video I release, so be sure and come back for that. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.